Oh, good afternoon, Professor Spooner.
Good afternoon, Frank.
How are you doing?
So once again, a lot of things have happened, but the thing that I've heard of today that seems to be most particularly relevant to our interest in globalization is that what's happened?
Nothing.
Can you see me?
I can see you just fine and hear you just fine.
Something's just happened here.
Let me stop the show. Good afternoon, Professor Spooner.
Good afternoon, Frank. So once again, a lot of things have happened in the past week, and it's really very difficult to keep up with everything because it's so disjointed. But one thing that has been in the news recently, which I think is very obviously relevant to our long-term discussion of globalization, is the Chinese Silk Road project. We've talked before about the fact that the number of people moving has been increasing over the last 50 years, and the intensity of movement, the amount of migration, much more than was ever the case before. And it's causing all sorts of problems, especially, of course, the refugees in Europe. People are trying to work out what to do to cope with the amount of movement across borders. But at the same time, things are happening that change the patterns of movement. And the main agent in this, I think, is China.
Mm-hmm.
China, it's interesting actually that China likes the idea of the Silk Road, which actually is a misnomer, but gives them the credit for having had connections with the Western world through Central Asia for a long time. But they're trying to get it going again because, after all, the Soviet Union had killed it. And since 1991, when the Soviet Union folded, it's been possible to think about doing things in Central Asia again, which hadn't been possible since the 1920s. But what China's been doing is building a railway, and so we've mentioned before that China has had a train leaving Shanghai and arriving in Tehran, and the train could go on all the way to London. I don't think.
Well, no, in fact, it has. It did.
Has it?
It did. The Prime Minister welcomed the arrival of the train with Chinese goods on board. Yes. It's quite
when
stunning.
Did that? I didn't see that.
Well, that happened early in the spring. I'll send you a link afterwards.
I only saw
quite an impressive event.
One.
Yeah.
Anyway, it still would be quicker to fly, I think, than
Of
get
course.
the train
Yes.
to London.
Yes. Well, look,
but it's no?
well, look, the Silk Road project, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I'm aware that there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure development going on. I mean, the Chinese are building cities as waypoints along the road. And in addition to the rail, there's also extensive highway building going on. What is the avowed purpose?
But in addition to that, something else that was in the news today was the amount of attention and investment that China is carrying out along the southern route, the maritime route from the east to the west, which, after all, I mean, there's been a very important maritime route from the Persian Gulf to the South China coast since the early medieval period, and have been involved in excavations of port sites in the Persian Gulf, which have amazing materials. And then, of course, the British in the 19th century developed a series of port cities from the Persian Gulf all the way around India to Singapore and Shanghai, which is really what made it the reason that Shanghai is such a great city today. But that sort of lost its purpose in the middle of the last century. Mm-hmm. But now the Chinese have started rebuilding it and picking out the port cities that they're interested in, all the way around India, which is getting the Indians very worried. and of course they have a lot of activity in Africa as well.
Correct.
Anyway, the China is building infrastructure, and it's building infrastructure in Central Asia and in the port cities of the south coast of the Asian continent and in Africa. And this is really changing the patterns of movement.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because as of right now, it's just commercial goods, so to speak, and construction battalions and things. What's next? What's the avowed purpose of this? Are they talking about moving citizens there? I mean,
well, it's making all sorts of things possible that were very difficult before. I mean, one of the big problems in Africa has been that, that there's been no infrastructure.
Right.
Well, the infrastructure has been in colonial territories, centered on the colonial capital of that particular territory, but nothing that helped Africa come together. And the Chinese are now doing things which are helping Africa come together. And I think what they're doing in Central Asia is the same sort of thing. I mean, what von Richthofen christened the Silk Road in the 1870s, when it came into existence in probably the 5th millennium BCE, was simply probably then a donkey route, and later became a camel route. But there were no roads, and even the Russians only built one single track railway all the way from Moscow to the Far East. To
Vladivostok, yeah. That's sort of like the heartland of the world, though, isn't it?
Yeah. In fact, there's since the colonial period broke the trading network, the colonial period with the Russian Empire and the British Empire fighting over what was called the Great Game in Central Asia in the 19th century, that disrupted the long-distance trade network that had gone through Central Asia from ancient times up until then. Then the Soviet Union completely put an end to it by building a barbed wire fence all the way along its southern border. But since 1991, it's been possible to reimagine it, but the Chinese are actually rebuilding it. So this trade route, which was actually the beginnings of civilization, because it was the area in which the largest number of people came into contact with each other, from the beginnings of the ancient world through the medieval period to a very long time. So it's almost the center of the civilized world, actually.
Right.
And then was completely cut off from everything else.
Right. So.
And now if the Chinese rebuild it and finish up being the dominating investor in the area, that's not only going to make all sorts of movement patterns that have a long historical history, possible again, but it's going to put China in a very in a much better position in relation to globalization than America, because America is separated by two oceans.
Right, right. I think that 100 years from now, when we look back at this, or if we could look 100 years into the future, I think we would be overwhelmed with the explosion of growth in that area along the Silk Road. I mean, those areas, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, all of those, the stands, as well as parts of Afghanistan. I mean, they're ripe, and as you say, they've been lying dormant now for 150 or 250 years, where in fact for thousands of years they were cross-pollinated by many different cultures, many different travelers and visitors, and it's just ripe for growth. It's ripe for an explosion of new ideas and new commerce and globalization and rapid movement of people and ideas, and it's going to accrue to the benefit of the biggest player in the game in that case, and it's going to be China. And
it's interesting that it was the Chinese that started the sea routes from China to East Africa.
Yeah, way back when they used to have ships with 9,000 Chinese sailors on board rowing the ships there, like 2,000 years ago.
And it looks as though they'll be doing similar things, or modern things, taking up the same pattern. And I wonder whether they, I've not heard any ideas of extending the Central Asian Railway into Africa, but that would be the next thing to look for.
Well, let me ask you a question. I mean, as we were going through this recitation of what they're doing, my American patriotic chords began to play a little bit, but then I backed off and I thought to myself, what's so bad about this, if anything? And I don't necessarily see any downside. This is what's supposed to be happening.
Well, I think that the future, our global future, will be, as a global community, will work much better if there are a number of big players in it, instead of one main player that is considered to have hegemony over the whole area. Mm-hmm. Because it has to, when 10 billion people are communicating with each other and engaging wholesale in collective learning, we need to make the most of all the different points of view, all the different approaches to problems. And that's not what's been going on the last 50 years with American hegemony. Mm-hmm. But I think that what is happening now is that there's really a significant advancement in several different parts of the world, which are independent enough to be able to collaborate with each other on a more equal basis than has been the case.
Well, that monolithic domination that was exercised by the United States for so long, I think is probably impossible today for any one country to exercise. So, as I say, I don't see that much of a downside for this kind of opening up of that route to the west for the Chinese. I think it's going to reawaken a lot of those Central Asian countries, and I think it's going to expand the horizons for the Chinese people. It's going to bring them into contact with cultures that they've been cut off from for thousands or hundreds of years at least, and who knows what it could do for Africa. That kind of cross-pollination could be exactly what the doctor ordered, so to speak, if I may use such a non-historical term, because of the infrastructure that the Chinese are going to bring.
Yeah, the problem is going to be the basis of collaboration, which the Paris Treaty was a good start for, relating to fossil fuels and climate change. But the global food economy and the global energy market are going to be other things that are going to require a great deal of collaboration between big players in different parts of the world. And at the moment, China is playing a very important role in all these things. Mm-hmm. And one of the most advanced contributors to alternative energy development.
You know, I'm just thinking aloud. It's such a remarkable advantage insofar as the type of government that exists in Beijing, that a group of people can sit down 5 or 10 or 15 years ago and in a very far-sighted manner begin to construct where they should be a generation hence, and then begin to move the pieces on the chessboard to make that happen. Where in the Western economies, everything is, what have you done for me lately? What are the results of the next quarter? When is the next congressional election? When is the next snap election? There's no looking beyond people's noses.
Well, we think in 4 or 5 year periods.
Well, in the United States, a 4 or 5 year period is an eternity. People don't think that far.
The big question is just exactly how what new structures will develop, because they'll have to be completely new structures to enable And maybe, perhaps even the United Nations will play a big important part in this, because I mean, since 1945, when everything in the UN began, it's been funding larger and larger numbers of people every year, flying around the world from one conference to another.
Mm-hmm.
And in each conference, there's a large number of countries represented and talking to each other. But the UN has not had any authority and hasn't really achieved very much, except that it has made it possible for the discussion to continue, without leaving it to individual countries to make their own steps. So maybe that will be the beginning of the collaboration that will look after the global resources, which is obviously going to be the next step.
That certainly will be the next step, because they're about to be exposed to more and more users. So it'll be very interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Professor Spooner, thank you very much as usual for your insight, and we'll look forward to speaking next week.
Good. See you then.
Bye-bye.